Hi, and welcome back from the Fantasy Football Profits. As always, we're here today bringing you guys another YouTube video. We're so excited. This is going to be a little fun video. You know, every season, like last year, comes out a star player or two or whatever that really helps carry fantasy teams to the playoffs and hopefully to championships. But we're going to talk about the greatest players who have done the most to carry those players. We're calling these the greatest fantasy seasons ever. So we're going to go basically according to position, first quarterback, then running back, wide out, tight end, kicker, defense. And then we're going to do some honorable mentions and finish it up with the greatest fantasy player of all time.
Single season, yes.
Yeah, single season.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. A lot of people last year wrote David Johnson, and he had a great season. They wrote him to the championship. And so we always go into the year, if you're a fantasy player, and you're hoping to have that one player who breaks out and has a historic season. If you do, a lot of times that one player can really carry you through. And so we're going to talk about the greatest single-season fantasy players of all time.
So why don't you kick us off, Rob? Start with the greatest single-season quarterback.
Okay, so for us, we have to look none other than future Hall of Famer, Peyton Manning. And this one, there's a lot of guys up there. We'll talk about some honorable mentions later on, but this one was really quite easy. But back in 2013, Manning threw for 55 touchdown passes, 5,477 yards. And, you know, and as an added bonus, even though the guy can't run to save his life, he's slow as molasses, he actually had a rushing touchdown that year. So he accounted for 56 touchdowns. It was an amazing year. In fact, only 4 times did he miss the bonus in terms of yardage. And usually what happened, I remember that year because I actually had him on my team that year, and he helped me a ton. One of the problems with that team is they were good, and oftentimes by the third quarter or even late in the second quarter, they would begin to pull back a little bit. They didn't throw the ball as much. They would pull them out early in the fourth, late in the third quarter. And so once again, he had a phenomenal season. He had the best single fantasy football season quarterback, Peyton Manning, 55 touchdown passes, 5,477 yards, and he added 1 rushing touchdown. It was a phenomenal season by far. And so that gets us to what was the greatest single season fantasy rushing season?
All right, so, you know, this one actually had a lot more competition. This one was really close. But Ladinian Tomlinson in 2006, rushing for the Chargers, unbelievable. Over 1,800 yards rushing, over 500 yards receiving, 31 total touchdowns. That's insane with 56 catches. I mean, what I like with this guy, you know, Ladinian Tomlinson fell in the end zone, but a lot of running backs who are really good at rushing, getting the end zone and stuff don't have as much value in PPR leagues, but he got 56 catches. So I tell you, in either league that you're in, PPR, half PPR, non-PPR, dynasty, no matter what league you were in, Ladinian Tomlinson was the guy to have. And so that was the best single-season running back in fantasy football ever was 2006. Man, he did it from the air and on the ground. It was unbelievable.
Yeah, he was great. In fact, we played in a league where we played doubleheaders. So instead of 13 regular season games, we played 26. And that year, I spent everything. I traded for him. I gave up tons of players to get him because I felt like he's a guy that could carry my team, and he did. 2 years that I had him, I ended up 23-3 and 22-4. I had a great record. What's interesting is that he had 31 touchdowns, like you said. Now, if you have a running back that ends up with 16, okay, so if you get a running back that ends up with, 1,000 yards, 16 TDs, that's a good year.
Yeah.
Like we'll be satisfied with that this year, right?
Yeah.
He basically did that twice. And so really he accounts for basically 2 really, really good running backs. And I remember that year, I really didn't need a lot of production after my second guy. That was enough to carry my team. He had a great season.
Yeah, carry your team quite literally.
Yes, so.
All right, so now we're going to move on to wide receiver, Rob. Who is the best single-season fantasy wide receiver? And I believe you said this is going to shock some people.
I think it's going to shock some people. So let's take a second. I'm going to ask you, who do you think that's going to be?
Go down in the comments below, actually. But pause this video, comment below. Who do you think had the best single-season receiving as far as, fantasy numbers goes?
Yeah, and I think a lot of you would say things like maybe Jerry Rice or Randy Moss, and they're going to fall on our honorable mentions. They had great years, but they're not the guy. They did not have the greatest single-season wide receiver. And so the guy that is, and maybe some of you have heard of him or not, but here's the guy, Don Hutson, the Green Bay Packers back in 1942. Now, I'll tell you why his season was so great. You really got to put it in context. You have to contextualize that a little bit. But here's what his year finished with that year. Now, his numbers were good, but compared to Rice and Moss, they don't seem to be that great. Well, let's start here. He had 74 receptions, 1,211 receiving yards, and 17 TDs. Okay, that's a good year. Okay,
Yeah.
I'll take that with a lot of my white. 17 TDs is phenomenal. But here's what makes that an exceptional season and why he was so dominant. They only played 11 games in the NFL back then, so he did that in 11 games. So if you were to take that, you divide it out, and you go into a 16-game season, here's what that turns out to be. In a 16-game season, he has 108 catches, 1,761 yards, and 25 TDs. By far the best wide receiver season that we have seen. But I want to talk a little bit more to put it in its context. Now, those numbers are great, but what he accomplished, if we were doing fantasy football back then, he would be undoubtedly the #1 pick above everything. Now, listen to this here. Okay. Now, once again, rules were different. They didn't pass the ball a lot. He had 74 receptions. Okay. The #1 quarterback that year had 146 completions. He had half as many. The second quarterback had 132, and after that, only one other quarterback had above 95. So he had almost as many receptions as the rest of the league had in completions. In fact, in 1942, no one ever passed over 300 yards. It didn't happen.
Yeah.
It just didn't happen. The running game was really the focal point of it. In fact, his 1,211 receiving yards actually bested all but 4 quarterbacks' total yardages that year. His receiving yards beat every quarterback except for 4. I mean, it's just amazing if you look at what he accomplished. And so here's the thing. That year, he catches 74 balls, right? Just take a wild guess. The next closest receiver in terms of receptions, what would you think it would be? He had 74.
Oh, man, I mean, if he had 74, you're thinking the next guy's at least got to be plus 50, plus 60, right?
Yeah. The next closest guy had 27 receptions. The guy dominated. So it's just crazy what he did. If you had him that year, you probably win the championship. In fact, you probably won it. The best wide receiver season for fantasy is Don Hutson, the Green Bay Packers, 1942. Phenomenal year. Christian, you're up next.
All right, so next we're moving on to tight end, and this is a very recent one, like the Peyton Manning season. Tight end Rob Gronkowski in 2011 had an unbelievable year. Yeah, we all know that, but let's reflect on some of those numbers. These are insane. 90 catches, over 1,300 yards, and 17 receiving touchdowns. Now, I say receiving touchdowns because a lot of people don't know that Rob Gronkowski actually ran one in. So he actually had 18 touchdowns total that year. With 90 catches, he's going in a PPR league too, and 1,300 yards is insane for a tight end. It's unbelievable.
Well, you know, I like Rob Gronkowski. In fact, I think that he's the best offensive tight end that's ever played the game. Now, with that said, I don't believe that when it's all said and done, he's going to pass Tony Gonzalez. I think his career totals are going to be lower simply because he can't stay healthy.
Yeah.
He plays physical. That's why he's a great tight end. But it's also a reason why he gets beat up. But once again, when he's on the field, you look at his production. I don't think there's ever a tight end that's been as productive as he has been. He's a true weapon.
Yeah, you know, those numbers are insane. Nowadays, I mean, in the modern NFL era, other than him and maybe Jimmy Graham for a couple of years, tight ends are lucky to hit 10. Like, 10 is a really great year for a tight end. And then that guy, you know, if a tight end gets 10 touchdowns, he's in discussion to be a 3rd or 2nd round pick. That year, Rob Gronkowski was worth a 1st round pick. And I would never do that. I mean, that's how dominant he was at tight end, easily the #1. So I believe you're up now for kicker.
Kicker. Now, some people undervalue kicker, how important it is. It's not an exciting pick. But I tell you what, there's games where I have won where maybe my quarterback, my running back, and some of them, they did all right. But I had a good defense that weekend, and my kicker had a good weekend, and they pushed me over the edge to win. So don't undervalue the importance of a kicker. The best kicker season ever in terms of fantasy football is Gary Anderson, the Minnesota Vikings, 1998. Now, he didn't just have a good fantasy season. He had a great season as a kicker, period. He didn't miss one kick that year. He hit everything. Although, okay, I know you're laughing there. If you look at the picture that we have, sadly, he didn't miss any kicks in the regular season. He did miss one in the playoffs against the Falcons that had he made it, we would have went to the Super Bowl. In fact, that picture, thank you, Christian, for putting that up there.
Picture.
That is the picture there where he missed the kick. And as a Vikings fan, that cuts deep. But he had a great season. He ended up with 164 points that year. He was 12 for 12 between the 40 and the 49 yards, and he was 2 for 2 beyond 50. And so he wasn't just getting extra points and field goals. He had a good leg. He had a strong leg. And he played for a Vikings offense that broke the record for most points scored up to that point. Now, later on, they were beat by some other teams, but up to that point, That was the most prolific offense in the NFL, was that team, and he dominated. Once again, the tragedy that season is he had a great fantasy season, had a great regular season, and then when it all mattered, he missed the kick that cost us.
Couldn't get it done.
Couldn't get it done. So that leaves you next, Christian.
All right, so next is defense, and this one was actually really tough, but we'll just get right into it. The Chicago Bears, the 85 Bears, obviously. This one took a lot more research. There have been a lot of great defenses all time, and there have been a lot of great fantasy defenses all time, and it was really hard to kind of figure out who separated themselves from the pack. But once you start to look into the numbers, you start to see that the Bears were far and away the best defense. There have been defenses that have allowed less points per game than the Bears, but let's look at some of their numbers. They only had 2 shutouts that year, which is okay. It's not great, but look at this. 34 interceptions, 27 fumble recoveries, 64 sacks, 3 safeties, and 4 touchdowns. That's unbelievable.
That is. Now, I knew they were a team that got a ton of pressure on the quarterback. I have to say, because he did the research on that, I had no idea. 34 picks and 27 fumble recoveries? That's insane.
I didn't believe it.
That's crazy.
I think I checked 3 or 4 different sites. I mean, at first, that's like Madden numbers right there.
It is. You know, boy, I would love to get, I'm hoping and praying this year I could get something like that. Any one of these players, if I can get one of them on my roster this year, I'm going the distance. So.
Yeah, you know, most teams go 3 or 4 years or 5 years without getting a safety, and they got 3 in 1 year. Man, they got after the quarterback. They forced fumbles, forced picks. They were, when I finally got down and looked at the numbers, by far the #1 fantasy defense. Just no argument. So now that we've gone through all the positions, we're going to kind of do some honorable mentions before we get to the #1 overall single season fantasy player. Rob, who are your honorable mentions that you did those?
Yeah. So here's some of the honorable mentions. There was a lot of great players out there. You know, in terms of quarterbacks, you think about Tom Brady's 50 touchdown passes, or Dan Marino hit 48. You know, really when Dan Marino did it, that was really quite the accomplishment, although he got bested later on by Brady and then eventually by Peyton Manning, but they had great years. In terms of wide receivers, Marvin Harrison in 2002, he had 143 receptions, 1,722 yards, and 11 TDs. Jerry Rice had a great year back in 1995, 122 receptions, 1,848 yards, and 15 TDs. Especially when you think in terms of they're in PPR leagues, I mean, that's phenomenal.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you can't forget about Randy Moss in 2007 with his 23 passes once again. When I look at running backs, think about Jim Brown. One year he had 1,863 yards. Now that's in 14 games. And so you put on 16, he's getting over 2,000. And he also had 15 TDs. Marshall Faulk. Now this is one that I always like Marshall Faulk when he played. Now here's what he did. He had 1 year where he had 1,383 rushing yards. That's not great. He had 12 TDs. That's okay. But he also had 87 catches for an additional 1,048 receiving yards. I mean, he was phenomenal. Both sides. He was such a dual weapon that year. Terrell Davis, many people don't know him, but 1 year he had 2,000 yards. He had 23 TDs rushing. We think about Emmitt Smith with 1,700 yards and 25 TDs. That same year, he had additional 62 passes that he had caught. And Priest Holmes. Priest Holmes played for Kansas City. He didn't have a long career, but the career that he had there, he was a dominant back. He had 1,400 yards, 27 TDs. He had 74 catches for 700 yards. And then Sean Alexander's 1,080 yards with 28 TDs. Those are some of the honorable mention guys that had great years. If you had any one of those guys those years, you probably made it far into the playoffs. Now, with that said, we've talked about the best season for each position, but none of these guys that we discussed is the best single-season fantasy player of all time. There's one more that we want to talk about that beats them all. You ready, Christian?
Yeah, ready. All right, so this one kind of took me by surprise. This was another older-fashioned player in kind of a different era, 1961, George Blanda. Now, most of you guys probably haven't even heard that name, but what he did was unbelievable. Now, when you originally look at his stats, he was a quarterback, and you look, he threw for 3,330 passing yards. That's pretty good. That was especially good for the era. He threw for 36 touchdowns, which was great for the era. In fact, even in modern football, a 36 touchdowns season for a quarterback is pretty great. That's not what makes him impressive. But you know what? It wasn't his rushing that makes him impressive. In fact, that year he only got 14 rushing yards. 14 rushing yards on the season. Here's what makes George Blanda so unbelievable. He was also their team's kicker. He got 64 extra points, 18 field goals. One of them was a 50-plus yard field goal, and two of them were 40-plus yard field goals. That's insane. I mean, you're getting a 2-for-1 right there. Not to mention that 64 extra points is far more than most kickers get these days in a season.
Yeah. So I took those numbers when you brought that up, and we took a look at them. And I took his kicking points and used Yahoo standard scoring. And I calculated that out, and I converted it as quarterback points only. If you take those kicking points and they turn out to be touchdown passes, that would be the equivalent of him throwing for 65 touchdown passes. And so can you imagine, you draft this guy as a quarterback, and you get all of his points. Kicker, I mean, what a phenomenal year that guy had.
Yeah, far and away the best player in a single season as far as fantasy goes. How unbelievable is that? I mean, now these players just couldn't play two positions, so I mean that gives them a little bit of an advantage, but still, man.
So, well, I hope you guys had fun here. Once again, just a video talking about the greatest single-season fantasy players by position. If you guys get anything like any of these players, any of this production, you're probably going to the championship. I certainly hope I do. Hope you had fun. Love to hear your comments. Subscribe. Let us know. Check us out on web also on Fantasy Football Profits. That's profits with an S.com. See you later.